Hi, I'm Nikki Lowe, and welcome to the Wisdom for Working Mums podcast show, where I share insights and interviews that support women to combine their family, work, and life in a more successful and sustainable way. Welcome to this episode. I'm your host, Nikki Lowe, and today I have something which I hope is going to be really useful to explore with you that can transform your professional and personal relationships. And it's something that I share with my clients as it's the secret ingredient that can really hold our lives together like glue, both at work and home. And it's the concept of trust. And it's a concept that you've probably come across before, but I'm hoping in this episode, I'm going to share a couple of components of trust that you may not have come across or even considered before. And really, we can't go anywhere these days without the concept of psychological safety being brought up, because it's so important for the way we show up and relate to each other. And I've had the privilege of supporting some very well-known organisations with their leadership development over the years. And any intervention I do, I always focus on psychological safety as the foundation. Why? Because it has so many benefits, like encouraging honest communication. Because when we have psychological safety, we know we won't be judged or punished for speaking our minds, and we can become more open and honest with our thoughts. And that level of communication really fosters understanding and is the foundation for any effective relationship. It also empowers growth and learning, because in psychologically safe environments, we know that making mistakes is not met with shame, but really an opportunity to learn and improve. And when we've got that, we feel safe to take risks, step out of our comfort zone, and really embrace personal growth like we may never have done before. It builds stronger connections. If you think about your closest friends or your most reliable co-workers, the chances are you feel comfortable around them because you know that they accept you as you are, that psychological safety is in place that deepens the connection and really builds support and understanding. But psychological safety also boosts creativity and innovation, because we know innovation thrives in environments where ideas are celebrated, not stifled, and we feel safe to explore and really dive into our creativity without judgment. And that's when you get the power of unlocking groundbreaking solutions and ideas. But it also reduces stress and anxiety. That psychological safety really reduces stress because it calms our nervous system, knowing that we're safe. And that enables us to focus on what truly matters and can really lead to that healthier and happier kind of life and work. So I always challenge my leadership development participants to think about how they can influence psychological safety. And to do that, we often focus on trust, and trust in a way that you may never have thought about before, because trust and psychological safety are actually closely intertwined, and they both play an essential role in creating those positive and supportive environments in any setting, whether it's workplace or team or relationships. But often we think about how much we can trust others, but trust is actually a two-way street. It involves both inviting trust from others and being willing to trust others. So it's about trustworthiness and trusting. And in this episode, I'm going to be diving into what it means to be trustworthy, about how we can actually invite trust from other people. But to do that, we have to start with, how do we define trust, and how can we cultivate it in ways that are genuine and effective? Well, my friend, that's where the trust equation comes in. And if you've not come across the trust equation before, I think you're going to really like it. The trust equation is a concept that was created by a guy called Charles H. Green. He's a speaker, author, and consultant specialising in trust-based relationships. So Charles Green, along with his co-author David Meister, introduced the concept of the trust equation in their book, The Trusted Advisor. So Charles makes it clear that the level of trust in relationship is the greatest determinant of the success of the relationship. And in their book, The Trusted Advisor, they propose the trust equation as a model to help us as individuals and organisations understand the factors that contribute to trustworthiness and how we can use it to strengthen trust with people. And they've put it into a simple mathematical formula that really quantifies trust based on 4 elements. And although my brain doesn't work in a mathematical way, it does love simplicity. And I love the simplicity of the trusted equation model. And the model goes like this. It says trust equals, and I want you to imagine an equation. So you've got trust equals, and on the top part of the equation, you've got credibility plus reliability plus intimacy. And on the bottom line is, with like a divided sign, is self-orientation. So you've got credibility plus reliability plus intimacy divided by self-orientation. So let me break down those elements, and hopefully it'll begin to make more sense if you can't imagine that. And along with this episode, in the episode podcast notes, you'll find the image of that equation. And I think when you see it, often seeing the visual can be really powerful. So let's break down those elements. First, let's talk about credibility. Credibility is the foundation of trust. And in this equation, it's all about being seen as capable, knowledgeable and competent in your field. Because when people perceive you as credible, they trust that you have the expertise and experience to really deliver on your promises or what they need. You have almost like the right credentials. Perhaps you're the subject matter. And it's largely a cognitive trait, but it also does have emotional elements to this. Like, does this person give us confidence? Do we believe the person is telling the truth and being honest about what you know and what you don't know? And for my perfectionist friends out there, it's a reminder that credibility isn't about being perfect. It's about being genuine and authentic in your interactions. So it's also about being honest about where you might not have the credentials or you don't yet know the information. So credibility is about words and ideas, whereas the next part of the equation, reliability, is all about actions. So reliability is about trusting that the person will do what they say they're going to do. It's like the art of keeping promises and delivering on time. It's about having a good track record and being consistent. And while reliability is largely behavioural, it does also have emotional aspects to it. When someone promises something, really we kind of are deciding whether we have the confidence that they will do it. And as working mums, we juggle so many responsibilities that sometimes it can feel like a circus act. But by setting realistic expectations and following through on our commitments, we build a solid foundation of trust with our colleagues and loved ones. And both reliability and credibility are largely rational forms of trustworthiness because they're more objective, they're more measurable. But the next 2 components of the equation, the trust equation, are a little bit different. And when I share them, often people are unaware until they have them kind of put in front of them, how they would impact their trustworthiness. And the first one of those is intimacy. And it might not be a word that you would relate to trustworthiness. And it's often a word that has different connotations to it. And I don't mean in terms of the physical intimacy. What we're talking here is about emotional security in dealing with someone, that you feel safe sharing information and you know that they will deal with that information appropriately. And it really relates to emotional intelligence, vulnerability and empathy. And the intimacy really explicitly deals with the element of risk in relationships because there's emotional riskiness on both parts, the truster and the trustee. And to bring this alive, I want to give you an example, and it take you back a few years to when I left university. And my good friend and I at university, after we left, we'd have these regular catch-up calls and we'd spend hours talking on the phone, listening to each other about how life, work and love was kind of unfolding in life post-university. And about a year after leaving university, we were having these, lovely long catch-up calls. She turned around and just out of the blue shared with me that her and her long-term boyfriend were splitting up or had split up. And what was interesting to me was that not at one point in any of those catch-up calls had she shared any vulnerability in her relationship, or that she was having difficulty, or that she was unhappy, or that she was thinking about kind of splitting up. And it had quite a powerful impact on me in terms of trust, which kind of I found bizarre at the time, but now knowing this, I understand why. And what had gone on for me was I was sharing my vulnerabilities in those catch-up calls, but I think what I didn't realize at the time, but what I felt in that trust was actually that wasn't being returned. So I was risking sharing my vulnerabilities, but she hadn't. And I get it, that's her personal choice. She didn't have to. She didn't feel comfortable for whatever reason. But it really had an impact into the degree of risk that I then took with her going forward in how much I shared. And what I now realise was that it had impacted kind of the trust in our relationship. So our ability to show up and be open and vulnerable with what's going on, like within reason. This isn't about sharing your deepest secrets with everybody, but it's about actually how much am I showing myself, because we can only trust what we know. And if we're not making parts of ourselves known, those unknowns create kind of a risk. We don't like unknown as human beings. We give meaning to that. So intimacy is like the sweet nectar of deep connections. It's about showing active listening and being emotionally present and opening up in an appropriate way. By opening up, you give permission for other people to do the same. So it builds that psychological safety, but it also lets others know that you genuinely care about them. And that can really kind of foster that lifetime of trust. Unlike the previous two elements of credibility and reliability, it's really difficult to describe and measure intimacy, and it's really harder to evaluate. But when I'm working with leaders, often I'll challenge them to be about how intimate are you as a leader? It's about that emotional openness and putting yourself into a position in which you're exposed appropriately and are willing to be open, because that really invites that trust. And I often think of Barack Obama, who role modeled, I think, this so well, because he used to really create intimacy when he was president in a really powerful way. He was great at telling stories, and stories tend to build trust, and they always had that personal element to them. He would often talk about Michelle and his daughters, or kind of his own internal experience in those stories, and that really gave us a window into his world. But also he did something in 2012 when he was president that really surprised people when he logged on to Reddit, the social news website, and he typed in, "Ask me anything." And at that time, he was like the 44th president of the United States and fielded really unscripted, crowdsourced questions from anybody on topics from politics to his hobbies. While most of his responses have kind of long since been forgotten, that extreme transparency and vulnerability really left a lasting impression. And Obama had no idea what questions he'd face when he logged into Reddit. But he had the confidence that his opinions, policies and positions would hold up in the face of that radical openness and vulnerability. And he didn't just do that for fun, because, incredibly busy man. He did it with the intention of building trust. So far we've addressed three concepts in like the numerator in the top part of this equation, which is the credibility, reliability and intimacy. And now we're going to look at the factor in the denominator. So kind of sitting beneath that divide line, which is the fourth component of self-orientation. And a high level of self-orientation actually leads to low levels of trustworthiness. And what we mean by this is self-orientation can be selfishness in its most extreme, and when people are in it for themselves, but that's quite often easy to detect. In business, the biggest challenge is often about self-obsession, seeing all things about being about yourself, almost like being too self-focused. So thinking like, will I look stupid? Will they think I don't know the answer? And it's that degree of like, how much are we shining the spotlight on us? Because self-orientation is when we're concerned primarily with ourselves and especially with our own desires, needs or interests. It's almost like the person who's wearing blinkers and they can only see themselves and their own world. And to give you an example of this, I was talking to a friend recently and he was saying that his brother is leaving a very, very well paid, very good job, primarily because of his boss. And his boss has been so focused on themselves to the detriment of the team members, including my friend's brother. And it has worn him down that much that he just can't see where his future is in this organisation. And he actually, as a last resort, went to his boss and kind of had this conversation about saying, look, I don't know where I'm going. I don't know where my career progression's going in this business. I'm really feeling demotivated. I'd really like your insights as to where you think I can go, and almost looking for like a confidence boost, a morale boost. And his boss just turned around and went, look, don't worry, this is the kind of organization, if you do the right things, you'll get places. Just look at me, I've just been promoted. And turned it right back round on himself. And in that moment, my friend's brother just knew that he could no longer continue, and had a few job offers on the horizon, and went and pursued it, and has ended up taking on this new job and handing in his notice, primarily because his boss has a high degree of self-orientation. Because it's interesting, you can score high in all the other areas of this trust equation, like credibility, reliability, intimacy. But if you're high in self-orientation, it can dramatically lower your scores, regardless of how credible you are and all the other things. Because if someone scores too high in that self-orientation, it can feel like they don't care about us. They're so wrapped up in themselves, they don't even notice us. Whereas someone with low self-orientation is tuned into the needs of others and consistently shows up in ways that kind of demonstrates that. And like intimacy, self-orientation is really difficult to measure, but we all know when we're in the company of someone who has high levels, and also when we're with people who have low levels, and we know which we'd rather deal with. So I hope this episode really has got you thinking about trust, and I hope it's given you some insights into your trustworthiness, how much you're inviting people to trust you, and actually what you can do to influence that. And I hope breaking it down into those 4 components makes it more practical. And I'd encourage you to reflect and really honestly ask yourself, where do your strengths lie in those 4 components of credibility, reliability, intimacy, and self-orientation? And also, which might be your development area or areas? And what's interesting is Charles Green, the guy who developed this trust equation, he tells us that we can actually gain more from focusing on our development areas rather than our strengths with this model. And that actually goes against normal strength-based approach. The normal kind of theory is if we invest more in our strengths, we get a better return on investment than focusing on our weaknesses or development areas. But the reason for this is if we perceive someone as consistent across all 4 components, we perceive them as being balanced, whole, complete, and like in sync. Whereas someone who has imbalances in those 4 components is perceived as incoherent, imbalanced, and inconsistent, which is at odds with what we want from someone we trust. So I encourage you to lean into your biggest trust challenges, as you might be unintentionally undermining your trustworthiness, just like my friend did. And remember that trust is that precious and often fragile aspect of our interactions. I always say to my son that we've got an integrity bank, and you want to be constantly banking in that integrity bank, because if it runs low, it's really hard to build it back up. And thinking about what might be the things we might unintentionally be doing that impact that. Because by actively inviting trust and being willing to trust others, we create that positive environment that fosters those meaningful connections and really nurtures our personal and professional growth. So let's go out and embrace the beauty of trust in all those complexities and experience the profound impact it can have on our lives. So thank you for joining me for this episode. Until next time, take care. If you've enjoyed this episode of Wisdom for Working Mums, please share it on social media and with your friends and family. I'd love to connect with you too, so if you head over to wisdomforworkingmums.co.uk, you'll find a link on how to do this. And if you love the show and really want to support it, please go to iTunes, write a review and subscribe. You'll be helping another working mum find this resource too. Thanks so much for listening.